Replayability is a funny thing, but it's an important factor for many of us when deciding to buy a game. For you to spend hours and hours in the same game world, playing as the same character, doing effectively the same thing, finishing up and deciding, let's do it again, speaks to a variety of different factors. It may speak to the quality of a game or your own nostalgic ties to that game. When you think of replay value, things like branching paths, procedurally generated content, different endings, or mechanics unique to each playthrough may come to mind, especially nowadays with studio budgets skyrocketing and indie developers experimenting with complex mechanics. Our idea of a game worth replaying is often based on the concept of novelty. Seeing or experiencing things you may not have on a first, second, or third playthrough is tantalizing. In massively multiplayer games, replayability is a concept baked into the core gameplay itself. You're playing the same game for novel prizes, hacking the brain's chemistry to deliver fresh thrills using the same formula. But in the grand scheme of things, this idea of replayability is brand new to us. Once upon a time, you wouldn't use the term replay value to describe a game. It was a given, of course you were going to replay a game. The majority of the Atari 2600 or Intellivision library was filled with games where the objective was just see if you can beat your previous score. Even in the days of the NES, where games more often began to feature linear story-based progression, what did you do if you beat the game? You played it again. I mean, if you shave off the fat, classics like Castlevania or Super Mario Bros. Can be beaten in an hour. But if you grew up with games like these, surely you remember spending hours, days, weeks, or even months with these games. Sure, there's things like the Warp Zone or Castlevania 3's impressively forward-thinking branching paths, but that only adds so much. So what is it that had us invested? What is it that keeps these simple tests of skill engaging and replayable decades after their release? Well, if you ask me, it's a one-word answer. Fun. Once upon a time, fun was king, and while that still holds true for many modern studios, it's less true now than it was historically. Many things keep us glued to a game. Great stories, engaging simulations, the satisfaction of completing tasks, and of course, fun. If Platinum Games has only recently popped up on your radar due to the Metal Gear Rising renaissance, it may interest you to learn that Platinum at one point were considered gods of the action genre. Now, if you ask me, Metal Gear Rising is a masterpiece, of course, but with titles such as Mad World, Bayonetta, The Wonderful 101, and of course, Vanquish under their belt, it seemed for several years that Platinum could do no wrong. Of course, Platinum did do wrong. Platinum did so very, very wrong, but they did right by Vanquish. The game, directed by Shinji Mikami, embodies the replayability by fun principle. At around 5 hours in length, and that's being a little generous, Vanquish is a good time, not a long time. I remember picking this game up on Boxing Day 2010. I begged my friends to give it a chance, but with a short campaign, no multiplayer, and a distinctively Japanese flavor in a bald Space Marines world, it was a tough sell. Well, it's been 12 years and I'm still playing Vanquish. Are you guys still playing Carl on Duty or whatever it was? Yeah, I didn't think so. Now, what is it that makes Vanquish so fun? So fun that I can still hop back in after all these years and have a hell of a time? Well, let's find out, shall we? The story of Vanquish is who cares. Okay, fine, but for what it's worth, I find the story of Vanquish doesn't enhance the gameplay in a meaningful way. I'd say this is somewhat less true for Metal Gear Rising, whose bombastic sense of humor and rather on-the-nose commentary of the military-industrial complex has now become the stuff of legends.
I think it's time for Jack to let her rip.
In Vanquish, Hillary Clinton is president, and Russia is led by Vladimir Putin wearing a diving suit. Orbiting Earth is a space colony called Providence, which uses a microwave transmitter to provide the planet with energy. Russia, whose leadership has been seized by one Zaitsev under a coup d'etat, has seized Providence and used it to destroy San Francisco. I must say, if ever such a device is constructed in real life, I beg you, please do not allow all of the energy to be concentrated in one spot. You play as Sam Gideon, a DARPA operative with a bad boy attitude, a reckless sense of courage, and a heart of gold. Sam joins Colonel Robert Burns, a cynical and jaded war veteran with a slightly less reckless sense of courage and a heart of pyrite. Together, they kill the entire population of Russia, if Russia's entire population was robots. Can Sam save the day and prevent total Yeah, he does. It's fine. Everything's good in the end. Putin is stopped, San Francisco is microwaved, ultimately everybody wins. The story blows. Burns is voiced by Steve Bloom, and it sounds like he's drowning in a sea of rusty nails every time he speaks.
Franklin, Rios, you two escort Sam!
But it's perfectly serviceable to frame the action, which is all an action game is required to do, so long as the action is good. Is the action good? Hell yeah. Vanquish is, at its most reductive, a cover-based shooter, but it is also so much more than that. It's fast, it's frantic, it's fun, and it's challenging. What distinguishes Vanquish from its cover shooter counterparts of the era is its focus on adrenaline-pumping speed. The R suit elevates the experience, allowing for Sam to fly across the battlefield using jet boosters and slow down time at will. It might sound like two simple mechanics, but the context in which they're used changes constantly. The jet boosters can be engaged at will, as Sam drops to his knees and lets the suit do the moving for him. The boosters can move in any direction, allowing you to escape from a hairy situation or careen into one, while firing at enemies in any direction, which will cause the suit's bullet time to be engaged. Bullet time allows you to pull off some tricky shots at a moment's notice. Doing a somersault, hopping over a barrier, or kicking an enemy in the face will give you an opportunity to slow things down before resuming high speeds. It never stops being satisfying. Never. This balancing act of exciting speeds and the superb feeling of power you get from shooting enemies in the face in slow-mo is the cocktail that I just keep coming back for. There is nothing like it. Outside of the core gameplay, Vanquish very much relies on its set pieces to deliver the thrills, and deliver they do. It's probable the reason Vanquish is so short is because designing these sections takes a great deal of effort. They're meticulously crafted to keep level variety up in a genre that can easily feel stale. The spectacle is glorious, but what's really impressive is how much fun it is to experience these sections even on the 10th replay. That's something you don't often associate with set pieces. There are trains, anti-gravity trains, massive battlefield sections. There are enemies camouflaged in the forest. You ride vehicles, control turrets. There is a goddamn stealth section, for crying out loud. It's never a dull moment in this game. You could beat the whole thing in one sitting if you don't have a social life, and Vanquish is, most assuredly, meant to be played over and over again. There may not be alternate dialogue, branching paths, or different classes, but there is the promise of fun. After each level, you're given a score based on how well you did. Like the gaming days of yore, there's something compelling about beating previous times or getting a higher score. Between this and the game's achievements, you're really pushed to try out some self-imposed challenge runs. It'd be a complete waste to only play Vanquish once. Of course, what havoc could you possibly wreak without a huge arsenal of weapons? Originally, Vanquish launched with a roster of guns I would say falls a little short of its potential, but with the DLC now included by default in all subsequent releases, the weapon variety here is nigh perfect. The R suit uses something called the Blade weapon system. A lot of acronyms in Vanquish, are you noticing that? Blade refers to the Battlefield Logic Adaptable Electronic System. Basically, you can pick up 3 guns, but it looks extra cool switching them. So you got the assault rifle, classic. Not a whole lot of damage per shot, but a high rate of fire and a huge magazine. Great for picking off little guys trying to escape. There's the shotgun, essentially useless anywhere other than a foot away from the target, but when it rocks an enemy's shit, it rocks an enemy's shit. The sniper rifle may seem like a poor choice for a high mobility action game, but it has its place. Rolling out of cover and hitting the bullet time gives you a chance to deal with annoying gunners or smack an enemy's weak spot. Oh yeah, the rocket launcher. What even can you say? Its only drawback is that it's got just 3 shots, but I kept one on me at nearly all times. Then we get into some of the more interesting guns. The anti-armor pistol, basically a little mobile sniper rifle. Little less range, but faster fire rate and more shots. Great for punching through armor. The disc launcher launches discs. It's a decent gun, but doesn't excel in any particular area. I prefer my weapons to be damn good at something and maybe not so great at another. The boost machine gun fires slowly, not super accurate, but it hits hard. The laser cannon fires a concentrated beam. It does good damage, and let's face it, beams are just cool, but it overheats quickly, which makes it unreliable in a tough spot. The LFE gun, kind of like the rocket launcher light, fires a large, slow-moving projectile which does respectable damage. The lock-on laser. This one is just a huge piece of shit. And finally, I've saved the best for last, my absolute gun foo for Vanquish. The heavy machine gun. This thing just shreds. Good rate of fire, good range, good damage, great for small enemies, great for large enemies. Never a situation where I don't want this thing along for the ride. Each one of these weapons can be upgraded in a kind of passive bonus system. Sometimes you'll find an upgrade node on the battlefield. Picking it up will boost either the damage, range, ammo capacity, or some other attributes of the weapon you have equipped. Picking up a weapon while you have the same one equipped at full ammo will allow you to slowly upgrade it as well. It's a nice way to incentivize you to put yourself in harm's way and grants a small feeling of reward for overcoming challenges. Dying in battle will downgrade the weapons you have by one level, which becomes almost an inevitability on the higher difficulty levels, but I don't mind this system. It pushes you to play your best, balancing the game's risk-encouraging movement mechanics with a feeling of consequence if you push things too far. The battlefield is littered with weapons of all kinds, mainly determined by RNG, but some areas have preset weapons. I usually stick with a handful of favorites, but you should never feel shy about switching things up in Vanquish. There's always an appropriate set of tools for any given problem, which is doubly true in the optional challenge mode, which allows you to take on 5 really difficult challenges, moving through areas as difficult sets of enemies spawn and impede your progress. The structure here almost reminds me of Doom Eternal, and speaking of Doom Eternal, there's another parallel there and something that's true of all action games. At the risk of beating a slightly overused term, thanks Gearbox, to death, I'll call it the badass balance. In action games, the purpose is to feel badass. Now that's not universally true. There are games where the objective is more tactical or making the player feel like a complete scumbag, but it's a generality I'm comfortable making in this case. Ninja Gaiden, God of War, Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, Devil May Cry, what's the binding link? Well, gameplay-wise there are many, but undergirding each of these games is a common principle. Make the player feel like a bad motherfucker. Now how is this achieved? There's a more complex answer to that question. In simplest terms, it comes down to the feeling that you're doing all of the insane things that your character is doing on screen. There are a lot of moving parts to this feeling. Responsive controls, huge lists of moves and combos, well-presented feedback during gameplay, be it animations or some delightfully chunky sound effects, all lead to a visceral sense of satisfaction that could only be described as badass. Yet for all of the minutiae that lead to this feeling, there's another layer of complexity that each developer needs to keep in mind. Challenge. See, watching a movie like The Raid or John Wick may give you a feeling like what I'm talking about, but there's something entirely different about being the one in control of the action. What begins as cool becomes a feeling of excitement that possesses your central nervous system, an intoxicating power fantasy that brings gruesome animations and exhilarating spectacles to life. Yet, this is nothing to us without the feeling of having earned it. Anyone who's played the Dark Souls series has doubtless experienced that euphoria after hours of trial and error of finally overcoming a hurdle and seeing those glorious words on screen. Victory achieved. Where Dark Souls is slow and methodical, Vanquish, and all the games like it, are much faster, and so it's their responsibility to deliver that feeling of victory multiple times per minute. Just inject that shit right into my veins, Doc. Oh yeah. In order to facilitate the badass balance, Doom Eternal introduced a system that is adored by many players and shunned by some others. Whereas Doom 2016 is a more straightforward shooter, Eternal is a game whose design is based on strategy, quick thinking, and resource management. Rather than simply using your favorites, there are specific weapons that work much better than others against specific enemies, so much so that to not use them would be to handicap yourself. However, because your ammo, armor, and health supply are limited, you're constantly forced to replenish each resource in the heat of the battle. There are specific ways to earn specific resources. Shooting an enemy within an inch of their life allows them to be glory killed, which replenishes health. Burning an enemy with the flame belch causes them to hemorrhage armor. Using a chainsaw to cut an enemy explodes them into an ammo piñata, allowing you to replenish resources required for both health and armor. It's a self-balancing system. You're allowed to keep moving, keep up the ultra-violence, and have a great time as long as you play within the rules that the game has designated. Fail to do that and, well, you may make it through the game, you'll have done so suboptimally, robbing yourself of that badassery that otherwise characterizes the Doom series. So the parallel here to Vanquish is the R's overheating system. As you boost around the battlefield and use bullet time, you'll begin to overheat the R's suit. If you manage to pause before overheating, simply moving around normally or taking cover will cool the R's back to baseline in only a second. But push the suit too far, fail to consider its current heat level, and the suit takes longer to cool, during which time it can't be used. You're left totally vulnerable. For the sake of this example, try to see the R's suit meter as a resource. You're given the tools to create some badassery to fuel your own adrenaline, but like Doom Eternal, you must play by the rules. Give a child nothing but candy for dinner,
Yippee!
and that candy loses its appeal. Make them eat their broccoli, and there's nothing in this world sweeter than that candy.
Yippee!
My point is this: the lows exist to define the highs. What makes pulling off an awesome move in Devil May Cry a worthwhile experience is the exceptional skill and talent it took you as a player to do it. The glory isn't just Dante's or Sam's or Doom Guy's, it's yours as well. They're your avatar, you're the one orchestrating the events. It's not simply second-hand badassery, it's first-hand, because you contended with the limitations. In this case, the R's suit heat level. As you become a more skilled player, the events unfolding on screen become more meaningful, more intense, and more fun. You're not just here for the ride, you are the Vanquisher. Maybe it was a slow start, you button mashed a bit and had a couple of fool's deaths, but each of those mistakes, those roadblocks to fun, have made you a better player and paid back that fun debt 100-fold. Every time From Software releases a new game, there's a discussion regarding difficulty sparked. Do developers have a responsibility to make games accessible to players of all skill levels? After all, they paid for the game. Shouldn't they be allowed to experience the game's content unrestricted? Well, I certainly don't have an issue if they as a developer decide to add a difficulty slider. I'd say the answer is unequivocally no. A developer doesn't have a responsibility to make their games less difficult in any case, any more than a developer is required to have a hard difficulty in an easy game, or a film director should be required to have Peter Griffin narrate the symbolism of a really cryptic movie. Holy crap, Lois, Danny's Apollo 11 jumper reminds me of the time Stanley Kubrick was allegedly hired by the US government in order to fake film of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. To be clear, Vanquish does have a difficulty selection, but if a developer, particularly one of action games such as Vanquish, decides that difficulty is inherent to the experience, that's their business. Whether they alienate or attract you as a consumer is a consequence of that decision. In any given work of art, the creator is trying to elicit emotions, experiences, and feelings to you as the one partaking. That holds true with action games. You can't ask for that to be changed without fundamentally changing the nature of the art. If feelings of glorious victory, pulse-pounding action, or even, yes, frustration are the intention of the work, then it's just as it should be. When action games limit the player's ability to eat candy for dinner by creating boundaries, whether they be R's overheating, ammo management, or difficult combos to memorize, the developers are saying something about the intention behind their work. And frankly, those high highs of badassery wouldn't exist without the low lows of repeated failure. Brim with confidence is Sam Gideon because you've earned the right to be confident, not because you're confident that nothing can ever harm you. Concluding my ramble about the badass balance, I just want to point out some more things about the mechanical purpose of the R's suit. You become so accustomed to moving quickly that when you hit an overheat state and have to move around like, well, every other third-person shooter ever, you feel completely naked and unequipped to deal with the fast-moving projectiles and enemies surrounding you. Yet, it's not over, not by a long shot. When you reach a critical health state, you're given one final hurrah as the world slows down in bullet time around you. Now you have to wait twice as long for the suit to cool down, but if you're quick and or lucky, you can escape from harm's way just in time to take cover. If you're lucky again, no enemies will pursue you behind cover and you can get back into the action again. It's a great second chance system. It slaps you on the wrist but doesn't feel too punishing. Just a reminder, watch your ass next time. Because the developers knew you'd have your eyes on the action, overheating causes the R's suit to pulsate loudly, giving you a clear audio indicator that you're overdoing it. There are a lot of little tricks like that in Vanquish, audio or visual cues that allow you to perceive important in-world information without having to take your eyes off the threat. For instance, weapons are all color-coded. The heavy machine gun is red. If I see red, I know I can perform a drive-by weapon swap. I don't have to physically stop and read the name of the gun. Or the rockets fired by these big guys. They begin to beat more loudly as they get closer to you. A nice way to know what's coming up behind you if you're distracted. From a presentational standpoint, Vanquish was pretty damn impressive back in 2010, and when you see the number of projectiles on screen at any given point, it still holds up at high resolutions. It's not always very visually appealing. There's a lot of gray and brown, metal and concrete, but this certainly causes the more interesting and colorful sections to stand out when they do come around. Also, running it on a PC with an uncapped frame rate makes all the difference in the world. I could never go back to playing the original release. Similarly to the environments, the soundtrack frame frames the gameplay well, if not particularly standing out. It reminds me a lot of the Zone of the Enders OST, lots of mid to fast-paced tempo electronic music, some industrial percussion, things appropriately slowed down during some of the less frantic points in the campaign. Enhances the action without hogging the spotlight away from Sam. Good stuff. If you've been swept up in the Revengeance resurgence, I urge you, don't sleep on Platinum's other games, and certainly don't sleep on Vanquish. There's a lot of shared DNA between these games. That signature sense of humor, while a bit less prevalent, is still at work here. All of the creative, predatory robot designs and visually stimulating boss fights of Metal Gear Rising are at work here in Vanquish too. While Revengeance has a much stronger emphasis on boss fights and one-on-one combat, Vanquish focuses primarily on making each stage a roller coaster, seeing how much insanity they can cram in before you gotta wrap up. It's an outstanding third-person shooter from an incredible developer in their prime. It perfectly encapsulates the badass balance, legitimate challenge and respect of the player's intelligence, and the sweet reward of adrenaline. So much so that its 4-hour campaign can be played time and time again, without ever dragging on. There's a lot of things you could say about Vanquish, but dragging on is not among them. Thanks for watching. This has been the first Majuularcade video, a shorter form series where I try to do a more focused analysis of a game or some component of its design. I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting me. You guys rock. In particular, those in my Person of Lordly Caliber tier: Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Sleepy, Hime Takamura, that's Avil's wife, and Avil, that's Hime's husband, Miles, and Scatmouth. If there's a difference in audio quality between this and the rest of the narration, it's because the number of people who became patrons since the original recording has gone up a lot, which is kind of a wonderful problem to have. Everybody's support means the world to me, and if you want to support me too, please consider liking, subscribing, or if you're feeling very saucy, becoming a patron at patreon.com/Majuular. Have a great day, and until I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.